presentation today is the seventh interval. It means that we have traversed a structure which in its clockwise motion went around almost full circle. And our whole first year of education was this kind of clockwise movement, following the path of nature, getting our educational strategy in touch with the way that nature happens. In fact, we began with nature. But we discovered that it's very difficult to find something there in nature realistically. That nature is elusive, actually. And that what records is existence, but not nature. That nature doesn't record. It occurs, and out of its ocean of change, out of its overlapping, non-lacking complexities, there seems to be a rain of particles that occur. And these particles eventually become atoms and molecules and the elements, and out of nature, an actual universe occurs. And we were born into this. So our education began with a kind of non-starting point. It began with the way in which the old beginning of the Torah, Genesis, began. It began with the word Bereshith, which means in the beginning. It means while all this is going on, this happens. And so existence is not the beginning of reality, but occurs as the first point of traction, the first juncture of processes and changes which registers so that we can at last say, this exists. And so our second phase was ritual. And from nature to ritual, we learned that there is a kind of a syncopation to a comprehensive education. That the education takes a process which is universal and then brings out of that process some kind of actuality which registers and has objectivity, and with those two together, with a process and with an objectivity, we have a step. It's like a night and a day. It's like nature begins with the night, and the sun rising makes a day, and the day is objective, whereas the night is kind of mysterious as a process. But a night and a day together make a comprehensive unit which is trustworthy. And so our education established in the first half of the first year with nature and ritual that this was a trustworthy method of proceeding. And what occurred to us then was, what's the next step? What's the next night and day that comes out of nature? When there's nature in existence, what else happens? And we found that for us, what happens is something that occurs in very small increments throughout nature, but with us comes to be a fantastic dominating quality, the arrival of language. And that after the process of nature and the objectivity of existence, the next phase, which is important for us in our education, is language. And this phase was traditionally always called something that had within its name a flow of language that indeed had a beginning and had an ending, and in between had some kind of development. The word in the West that we use for this is myth. And what is characteristic of a myth is that it has a plot line It has a definite beginning, has a definite end, and it has a complication in between that links the two together. But a myth, a mythos, a language process that has this narrative line, beginning, middle, and end, and it can have many of these plot lines, tends, because it's a process and not an objectivity. Language is like nature rather than existence. It's always changing. It's always in some kind of flux. And we found that in our third phase of language, that like nature, it seeks to have an objectivity that comes out of its movement, but that the movement itself is not objective. And we realize that there's a kind of a deception here for us because we think that language are words and that words are things, and words are not things. Words only become things when they register in the mind. That the objectivity that reigns out of language are symbols. And that realm of objectivity, where the symbols register in the mind, is as real as existence. So that the mind is actually very objective. It's not mystical at all. On the symbolic level, in fact, the mind is so objective that we can learn to deal with it and make forms, to make symbolic forms in the mind that are so objective that they can be applied to the process of nature and can change the way in which existence registers. Someone who understands the fermenting process can take water and hops and barley and make beer. Someone can actually take an idea of a distillation process and make a pure alcohol. Or one can take a mathematical formula, E equals mc squared, and make atomic power. So that symbols in the mind are objective. They're as objective as the existent things that occur ritually. And we saw then that there is an intimate linking together. That the mind with its symbolic objectivity has a great affinity with existence and its ritual, established objectivity. And the great focus for us individually of existence, of ritual objectivity, is our body. So that the mind and the body are very close together in terms that they are both objectivities, and they work together very often as a pair. What links the two of them together is the process of language. So that very early on, when human beings began to learn about the strategy of learning how to be wise, when men and women learned to use language in a wisdom way, one of the earliest formulations that you find is that someone needs to be wise in thought, word, and deed. Symbol, myth, and ritual. That if you get an alignment where your thoughts, your words, and your deeds are aligned, nature will be there to complete it. That the whole ecology of those four will have an integrity, and that integrity will manifest itself like a universal blessing in an integration, so that nature and ritual and myth and symbol will, as a foursome, integrate together and knit together and make a fabric of life, which one can live, actually, and one can trust. And so, even many thousands of years ago, perhaps tens of thousands of years ago, men and women, much like us, understood that this is how it is. And this is what to strive for. Occasionally, not very often, but occasionally, there was some exceptional woman or some exceptional man who would experience in themselves the process of distillation. And it isn't just that distillation applied to water and barley and hops will make a beer, but that the process of distillation is a universal one and also occasionally, rarely, but nevertheless does happen to someone's integral. To someone who has their body, their words, their deeds, and nature all aligned, there occurred these very rare and yet very real events where someone distilled themselves and emerged into a different phase. It was no longer any of the four recognizable phases, but was like a quintessence, a fifth essence. We call that today consciousness. Or if you wish, you can call it self-consciousness. That you're aware that you're aware. That you know that somehow you have woken up. But what have you woken up from? And to where have you awakened? Because as nature is a process and language is a process, consciousness is also a process. And so it does not have an objectivity. It doesn't register anywhere like existence or like ideas. It doesn't register like an objectivity in the mind of an image. Vision has no objectivity. And we call in our education consciousness, we call it vision. We use the term that came into use in Middle English about Chaucer's day, because in that time, the 14th century, the English language underwent this tremendous broadening of scope. And the age of Chaucer was also an age of genius in the English language. All the great English mystics of the 14th century, men and women, enlarged the capacity of the English language to include within humanity these farther reaches which before then had been called something occult. Something, the term that was used in Old English meant magic. Whereas in Chaucer's day, men and women were humane about this. And they said, it isn't magic like in occult stuff. It's like visionary in terms of man being able to inhabit, men and women able to inhabit conscious dreaming. And so one finds in the 14th century a lot of English literature, a lot of English mystical writings, a lot of English philosophy that dwells upon the fact that dream images are very similar to the kind of images that occur in advanced consciousness, but somehow they're different. And so out of this, in the 14th century, comes an English language understanding that these new language forms are not dreams, they're not myths, they're not magic, but they belong to a realm of fairy tales. They belong to a realm where somehow the fairy tale is different from the myth. The myth always includes a plot line, a narrative line, a beginning, a development, and an end. But a fairy tale has a structure which includes a twist at the end, so that the end is a transformation rather than an ending. And so a visionary language arose. And the word vision, which we're using in our education, because we're using an English language teaching mode, came to present rather than represent, came to present the working of an idea rather than to represent the meaning of an idea in terms of its integration. It came to present a further application, a further resonance of the idea. And we saw that one very easy way to tell the difference is that symbols have a twin capacity. On one hand, they preserve meaning, and on the other, they develop and explore new meaning. The preserving of meaning is the function of a symbol as an amulet. Keeping the integration together, keeping it formed, keeping it protected, keeping it there in the mind. Whereas a fairy tale is not interested in keeping it, but in exploring a transformed, new horizon. And this is the symbolic function of the talisman. An amulet protects meaning, but a talisman is something you take with you to go exploring. If you're hoping to be protected in a dangerous situation, one would like to have an amulet to protect one. A cross around the neck, you're in vampire territory. We better have that cross. Whereas a talisman is the wooden stake and the mallet. You're not just going to protect yourself, but you're going to be free to explore every aspect of this, and you're well able not only to defend yourself with an amulet, but to explore and do your own defending with a talisman. And so visionary consciousness found that this other aspect of symbols was something that needed to be explored, with the proviso that it was to be understood not to be objective, but to be a process. But the whole integral experience of men and women, not just men and women in our species, but men and women in all the species back through millions of years and even before our species came into play. In fact, the characteristic of nature for the last 15 billion years is that the integral ecology, the integral cycle, is whole in itself, and it is indeed. So that this quintessence, this visionary fairy tale realm, this new process, this third process that comes into play, is different, and because it's different, it tends to have several qualities come into play. One of them is that initial forays into visionary consciousness seem to one, in remembering them in terms of the mind, to be unreal. To equate them with a dream. Oh, I had a dream. I didn't really awaken. Or to equate them with a myth. Oh yes, I am living through this particular narrative line. And so, for several thousand years, it was a real difficulty for men and women to recognize that consciousness was not dreaming and was not mythology, but that it was in its own right a viable fifth phase that could occur and does occur, rarely yes, but definitely nevertheless. And so it came about 2,500 years ago in India that the historical person known as the Buddha was the very first person in that part of the world, perhaps in the whole planet, to establish a familiarity with the processes of consciousness, with having navigated on the ocean of vision long enough to lose the bad habit of reductively equating it with dreaming, to lose the bad ritual comportment of reductively equating it with some kind of imagery in the mind. and what's more important and deeper, to lose the taste to experience consciousness in terms of symbolic ideas which are objective. And so, the historical Buddha was a very odd character. He was someone who learned to fly by having learned to spread the wings of vision and to jump off out of his mind. And not to consider himself crazy, not to consider that he was living through some mythic narrative, and especially not to fall into the very easy, natural, integral, reductive habit of thinking that you're just dreaming. And so we come today in interval 7, after these 4 phases of the first year of education. We saw that it was like having wound up a process all the way to its integration, where nature compacts itself until finally in the mind, we're able to compact through images and ideas and to bring the ceaseless movement of nature, the tremendous variety of existence, and the ceaseless movement of language, and the tremendous variety of images and ideas, to bring that whole ecology into a single pattern which has but one center, and that center takes itself uniquely out of the movement, out of the proliferation, so that the center of the pattern of all occurs as a stillness, the only still point there is in reality. And that it occurs not in some kind of geometric space of existence. It never occurs in existence. That still point never exists. It occurs only when the mind is a pattern of the all and finds its exact center. And there it experiences itself as stillness, as a zero. The phrase that came to those men and women in those days and comes to us just immediately whenever you experience something like that is that it's empty. There are no qualities, there are no images, there are no ideas, there's no movement, but there's a tremendous strategic sense that one definitely is still, that zero exactly occurs. And so emptiness was considered, paradoxically, always, even today, a form. And later on, when Buddhism found its supersonic refinement, it found its supersonic refinement in Japan. The Japanese are great at refining, and they refine to the nth degree. And they refined this down to a single little riddle, a Zen koan called mu. Emptiness is form. Form is emptiness. You can take it either way. Emptiness is a form, and that form is completely, absolutely, totally empty. Has no content whatsoever. So it's like a transparent zero, which occurs, but its occurrence never registers in existence, and also never registers in the mind. Because the mind is still in the integral cycle, and so something peculiar happens. The mind turns itself inside out. And when the mind turns itself inside out, through a kind of a distillation process, there's a complete reversal. It's like a negative printout. And instead of there being a zero, stillness at the center of the mind, at the center of the ecology of integration, there is a point. And instead of everything else occurring and having ideas and functions, everything else becomes zeroed out. And so the zero becomes a point, a seed, and all the things of the integral cycle become vanished. And so one goes from a complete universe that has a single mysterious 0 point to a universe that everything is zeroed out, everything is stillness, except this one vibrant point. And in Buddhism, that point is called bodhicitta. It's called the seed of the thought of enlightenment. And when that occurs, it's like an astonishment. And of course, as one would expect, if there's any vestige of habit left in you, you right away, quicker than the blink of an eye, go back to some analogy and think, I must be dreaming, or I must be crazy, or I must be thinking this, and therefore it's a thought that I have rather than an actuality. And there are many variations of those three. But the Buddha was historically the first person that we know of who stayed there in that transformed way of being. He stayed in consciousness. He didn't go back into ritual. He didn't go back into myth. He didn't go back into symbol. He didn't disappear and be absorbed back into nature, but he stayed conscious. One of the most peculiar images, and he did this when he was about 35 years old, and he taught for 45 years. How he taught is one of the paradoxes, one of the peculiarities. Because when it first occurred to him in a very powerful formed way, when that 0 point occurred, and that turning inside out occurred, he realized quite clearly that there was no way to teach this. That someone who is still in the integral ecology of nature would have no way to hear a language. They would, by nature, hear it mythically. And if they were to do something about it, they would, by nature, do it ritually. And if they were just to think about it, they would, by nature, do it symbolically. And that none of those three realms, wonderful though they are, thought, word, and deed, capable of being aligned with nature and producing this enlightenment, nevertheless, all three of those realms of thinking, of speaking, which is the realm of feeling, and of doing, which is the realm of sensation, have no relationship whatsoever with the realm of insight consciousness. Because insight consciousness is like a distillation. It's a transformation. It takes the form and goes beyond it. It transforms. And so someone who is then living in a transformed way faces an insurmountable problem that they could never tell someone. They could never show someone. They could never pass their thought on to someone who hasn't already done this. It's like an ultimate catch-22. Yet the Buddha, the historical Buddha, for 45 years taught. And it's a peculiarity. It's an oddity that this actually, apparently, historically, was able to happen. And towards what came to be the end of his life, when he was about 80, within 3 months of his death, he let everyone know that he was the kind of being who didn't just die, but that what he was going to do was to relinquish his life, relinquish his existence, relinquish his mind. He was going to let them go, and let them go to wherever they go, and that he was going to sever his living actuality with nature, ritual, myth, and symbol. He was going to let the universe of integration go. In other words, he was going to die. And in those final 3 months, it became a cause célèbre, a real problem for men and women. Both followers of the Buddha for 45 years. He'd gotten several thousand followers, not a great many. But there were also many who were jealous of him, who were suspicious of him, who were critical of him, who were disbelievers of him. And everybody started following him as if he were like, I guess this week for us it would be like somebody getting close to hitting 61 home runs. Everybody is following the next at bat. And so every time he spoke, every kind of person was attentive. What is he going to say? Is he going to finally confess, well, yeah, he is wrong, or he's a phony, or that he's right, and here's the secret? What is it that he will say? And when the time came for his death, and he hadn't said anything peculiarly conclusive, they watched the funeral ceremonies as if at last we've got him. At last we're going to tack the Buddha down. His fantastic consciousness is not going to help him now. His mind, his symbolic mind is not going to help him now. His language, even though he says it isn't mythic, we know it's mythic, but his language is not going to help him now. He's going to be left with just his body, his helpless body, and we're going to watch and see what happens. So they put Siddhartha's 80-year-old body on the funeral pyre with all the flowers and incenses and burnt it. And as the fire burnt, this is how the Parinirvana Sutra records in this paragraph. Now, as the body of the exalted one burned itself away from the skin and the integument and the flesh and the nerves and the fluid of the joints, neither soot nor ash was seen. Only the bones remained behind. Just as one sees no soot or ash when ghee or oil is burned, so as the body of the exalted one burned itself away from the skin, the integument, the flesh, the nerves, and the fluid of the joints, neither soot nor ash was seen. Only the bones remained behind. Notice the repetition. Why is there a repetition? There's a repetition because the characteristic manner of the Buddha speaking was to take you through a cycle and then to take you back through the cycle. To specifically take you through a cycle of integration and then reverse field and take you back through that cycle of integration and drop you off exactly where you'd been picked up. The technique is the only technique that he found that was capable of teaching in face of the paradox that he couldn't teach it. You cannot teach to someone in the integral cycle a differential consciousness. They cannot learn it. They cannot hear it, they cannot do it, they cannot think it. It's impossible. It's totally impossible. Yet, what you can do is you can create conditions where they can tear and compare, where they get taken through some kind of a cycle and then taken back through that kind of a cycle, sort of in a double whammy, and left exactly where they are, exactly where they were, only when they are dropped off after having gone through this double cycle, they themselves notice a slight discrepancy. They're not quite exactly who they were. And it's this slight discrepancy that occurs within them naturally that is their bodhicitta. It's the beginnings of their thought of enlightenment. It's the sliver of actuality, of a quintessence, that they cannot figure out in terms of nature, ritual, myth, or symbol. Yet they know damn well that it's real. They can feel it, they can think it, they can experience it sensationally, and they can guess that something in nature is different. I have been taken from I remember exactly how I was. And I was taken through all of this, and then all of that was completely undone. Everything that was raised up was taken down, and I've been dropped off exactly at where I was, and yet something's different. And it's that slight conviction that I know that something is different is the seed of developing differential consciousness. That's the way the Buddha taught. That's the way enlightenment education has always functioned when it's real, when it's realistic. The false teachers, the false gurus always think they can tell you about consciousness. They can put these superior thoughts, words, deeds into you, and it cannot be done. It's impossible. They're deluding themselves, first of all, to even think, to even say, to even do that kind of activity. It's an immediate symptom of somebody who's immature. Immediate. It's like seeing skull and crossbones, like seeing chemical slick on a stream. Don't drink that water. Their gorgeousness is because they're poisoned. Their iridescence is not due to spiritual beauty, but through contamination. It's radioactive. Whereas the sign of a real teacher is that nothing happens. There's no gorgeousness. There's no iridescence at all. They're completely ordinary. And that's what's so paradoxically extraordinary. They are just like us, only something odd is going on here, because I'm not exactly the way I was, and yet I'm supposed to, by all accounts, be exactly as I was, and I'm not. And it's that discrepancy, it's that difference that's the beginning. It's the pebble in the boot that finally causes you to stop and sit down and take the boot off. And you realize that there is no pebble in that boot at all, but that there was a conviction that somehow there was. That's the moment when you have an opportunity to get into consciousness and stay there. Because one finds, just like there being no pebble in that boot when you took it off, one finds that at the center of one's sensibility, at the center of one's feeling, at the center of one's thought, there was nothing wrong whatsoever, and yet you felt there was a problem. And the objective accuracy of finding out that there was no problem is the key that wakes you up. There was no problem. Nature was wholesome. The rituals were exact. The myths were plentiful and full. The symbols were accurate, and there was nothing, and now there's something else. There's the realization that there not only is something else, like consciousness, but it has its own ecology. It has its own development, its own four-part development, which is exactly weaving back through integration, going the other way. That differentiation is a turnabout coming back through the other way, a counterclockwise motion. And so in wisdom traditions, there was a consistent pattern of wisdom education. One had a beginning, something actually started it. One had a middle, which was the conclusion of that whole cycle, of that whole ecology, but that the conclusion was not an objectivity. The conclusion was a turning point. Instead of you reaching a period, you reached a comma. Or instead of reaching a comma, you reached a dash. To be continued. But that the continuation, instead of continuing in the circle, went back the other way. So it was a turning point. It's called in ballet a pivot. And the pivot is your guarantee that you now have mobility and the capacity for balance. And you realize after a while that what you're doing is not just going back through, but you're creating a kinesthetic certainty in your body, a symbolic accuracy in your mind of balancing out nature with consciousness. Now, when consciousness and nature are balanced together, when both ecologies are full together, one comes back to the supposed starting point, and you have lost the taste to identify it as a point. You're no longer interested. So that the transformation from a mythic language which has a beginning, a middle, and an end, 3 points, becomes a process that has a definite beginning, but instead of a middle point has a pivot, and instead of an end point has an infinite openness. You come back to where you were with the capacity to have so much differentiation that you have reached. In the West, our phrase, traditionally thousands of years ago, was eternal life. At the end of the sayings of Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas, he says, "Whoever tastes the hermeneia of these words will not die." Whoever gets the flavor of interpreting in conscious balance to integration, this kind of language never has an end, has life eternal. The Buddha said, work out your own salvation with diligence. And the salvation is not getting to somewhere, but coming full circle back through it to realize that the starting point was arbitrary and it doesn't have any actual where to be. That realization makes you free. That realization shows you that the starting can be anywhere, at any time, in any form, and it will still work out, and you will still be able to pivot and still be able to come back to complete openness. That's the difference between wisdom and very expensive hype. If you've been to some of the weekends, you know how expensive it can be. Or if you spent 30 or 40 years trying to figure out through a welter, a phone book of girls, you could realize that doesn't really do anything at all. It just builds up a symbolic overlay on a mythic mud that has as a bedrock rituals that finally aren't very cute. No. And that whole ensemble is a knot. Whereas the waking up is the distinctive capacity to see the knot as a bow and to pull it open and to unveil the present, which is always your freedom, your capacity to be real in any way that you wish. Let's take a break and we'll come back. And so, when the Buddha's body was burnt, what was left was his skeleton. And it was a peculiar thing that there was no ash at all, and there was no soot even. But when the fire had banked down and burnt out, his skeleton was left intact on the mound. It presented a terrible problem to the Buddhists. because they were taught that everything is impermanent. But it wasn't that the skeleton was left was so much a challenge to them. It was the temptation to take those bones and consider them sacred when they knew that they were not sacred. The Buddha's teaching was all about, do not put your trust into ceremonies. Do not put your trust into rituals. Don't put your trust into the mythological patterns. They're fine when you're in nature, but when you're in consciousness, they have no bearing whatsoever. And if you give them a bearing, it means that there's a retrogression that comes into play. And as long as you keep in mind that it's a retrogression, you're okay. But if you forget it, it becomes a regression, and then you're not okay. And because consciousness, when it regresses into the integral cycle, is not identifiable at all. You don't know that you're in a regression. There's no way to know. Because consciousness does not factor in any objective way. It's there, but it's there in an empty way. It's only when you do computing and you carry the numbers that register over into new columns and new orders that you realize that the columns and the orders are still there. They still function, but they're not there on the page. When you add a column with figures and you get more than 9, then you have to carry over and start a new column. Well, those columns, those orders are there. Consciousness is there, but it doesn't register. So you can't count it, and identification is all about what you can count. It has to be. So the insidious thing about the regression of trying to include transcendental consciousness into the integral cycle is not only that it doesn't register, but in order to make it register, you have to make a fictive metaphysical quality to nature which doesn't belong. And that's where we get into trouble. Then you say, oh, well, transcendental wisdom is an occult knowledge. Crap. There's nothing of the sort. Oh, well, there are adepts from some other dimension or some other planet that, do this or that. Not at all. Not at all. But to think that, or to believe that, or to act upon that as if it were true, creates an as-if situation that, because it's neither integral nor differential, has no way of being kept track of. And so what you're faced with is a radioactive proliferation, or to use a more kindly example, you're faced with the situation that the Star Trek ship got when it had trouble with tribbles. They're completely harmless, it's just that they keep multiplying. And eventually there's no room for anything but tribbles. So a regressive consciousness into a metaphysic is insidious not because it's evil, but because it doesn't leave any room for anything else. Everything else is crowded out. You forget to feed the baby, you forget to feed yourself. And life becomes like an afterthought, and what really matters is getting to the bottom of it all. Well, there's no bottom. And it is a fruitless endeavor, totally fruitless. It doesn't go anywhere, but it doesn't go anywhere in the way that emptiness doesn't go anywhere. Emptiness doesn't go anywhere because it doesn't need to, but this kind of regressiveness keeps trying to go nowhere, and that's what's wrong with it. And so it turns out to be a negating, a flatting out of all of the qualities that are necessary for life. So one gets into, and it isn't just metaphysics as in some like religious thing, it's metaphysics in terms of life processes where you don't even notice that you're completely negating life. It's like the pall of smoke over Indonesia now makes people gasp over about 2,000 miles of territory because they're burning all the rainforest, and because of the drought, there's no moisture at all, and so the fires are out of control. And you can't see more than a mile in Kuala Lumpur or Singapore currently, or in Bali currently. It's like destroying nature and life by flattening it out, by making negation areas. And so what comes up are blind spots increasingly. All for the glory of making this metaphysic go somewhere glorious. It's not only wrong, it's just stupid. The traditional ascription of this kind of mentality is ignorance. And in fact, traditionally, when the Buddha, when he did that under a tree we all know as the Bodhi tree. There's one planted out in the back of this building. This is a leaf of it. But what usually is forgotten is that there were 4 trees. There were 4 trees because there was a frame of reference. There was a square of attention. Remember our education. That in order for an integral to register itself coherently, there has to be a frame of reference. So this frame of reference, this picture, the big picture, the square of attention, always has 4 sides, it always has 4 corners, it always has this kind of squared quality. And so 4, a quaternary, is a universal form in which integration happens. It always happens this way. You can trust that. You can put your life on the line in terms of that and live. So there were 4 trees, and the Bodhi tree was just the first of the 4. And under each of the 4 trees, Siddhartha sat for 7 days, so that there were 7 days in each of 4 trees. So if you put those together, that square of attention was a lunar cycle, 28 days. The Gospel of Matthew is 28 chapters. It's a lunar cycle of wisdom. And if you look at it in terms of 4 phases of wholeness, you get what Matthew is talking about. Why? Because he was really well educated, because he has a teacher who knows. So the Buddha, when he's teaching himself, the Bodhi tree was just the first 7. There were 3 other 7s that came there, each registering in a tree. And after the Bodhi tree, which is a sort of a ficus tree, its species is like a rubber tree. The second tree was called the Agapala banyan tree. Banyan trees spread forever. In Beverly Hills, there's a Morton Bay fig that's very much like a banyan tree that takes up about 1/3 of the whole city block there on Beverly and Little Santa Monica. And if you look at it, the trunk and the roots are just incredibly complicated. Whereas a Bodhi tree, if you look at a Bodhi tree, it tends to really be strong together. Though it can have multiple trunks, they grow together and grow into each other, so it's like the strength of a cable. It's like a steel cable. The Bodhi tree as a tree is like a cable of strength, which is why the symbol of it isn't just this beautiful triangular fan shape, but the tree itself, the Bodhi tree, is strength, real strength. Whereas a banyan tree is not the strength of a cable, but it is the immense completeness of complication. Agapala means a tree under which somebody who has a flock of goats rests those goats from the sun. So it's like the goat herd's tree. It's a place of rest, which also is a locus of complication. And so it's under the Agapala banyan tree that the first person, a Brahmana, a wandering upper class intellectual, comes to the Buddha and he asks him, what are the qualities? What are the real qualities? What do I need? What do I need to know in order to be myself? In order to be, what do I need as a Brahmana, need to accomplish to be a Brahmana? Well, now, under the Bodhi tree, the Buddha traditionally had gone through what in Sanskrit is called pratitya samutpaya. It means the chain of dependent actions, of which there are 12 nidanas, and that they always link together. That is to say, their particular identities are circles, or ovals if you like chains, but they're actually like circles. And that each of those circles includes within its circleness the circleness of something else, and that all 12 of these together are like a necklace which we wear and which weights us down so much that we cannot fly. We have everything that we can do just to deal with it. So ignorance, which starts this chain of dependent, not independent, but dependent origination, that in order to free yourself from this, you have to free yourself from all 12. You can start anywhere, but wherever it is that you start, you have to know where you go from there and continue all the way through to free yourself. And the usual starting place is ignorance. I won't go into it because we don't need to, in this age, have that specificity. We know by now, 2,500 years ago, it was very new. But we know by now the complications that are there. So under the Bodhi tree, the Buddha had not only gone through the chain of dependent origination, but had reversed it and went back through it and differentially unlocked the whole thing, so that when he came back exactly where he had started, only with that little bit of difference. In the West, it would have been called Socratic ignorance, knowing that you don't know. For the Buddha, he knew that there was no way to teach this. The traditional wisdom stories are very exact, and they go to the nth degree. They say, not only did he realize there was no way to speak about it, because there was no possibility of language, but that there was nobody here to speak. He wasn't really there in any way that could be construed. And there was no one to speak to. And all this ecology of disillusionment comes in terms of food being offered to him, finally. Under the fourth tree, there are 2 people that come. Under the Agapala banyan tree, there's 1 person that comes. And under the fourth tree, called the Rajayatana tree, there are 2 people that come, 2 traveling merchants. So here's the Bodhi tree. Here's the Agapala banyan tree. The third tree is called the Mukalinda tree, sometimes pronounced in ancient times Muchalinda, a big flowering tree, and then the Rajayatana tree. Under the second and the fourth trees, under that horizon, men came to him, 1 and then 2, to ask him for teachings. But under the Bodhi tree and under the Muchalinda tree, he was by himself. Only under the Bodhi tree, he was by himself in the doing and undoing of the thoughts of dependent origination. But under the Muchalinda tree, he was surrounded by a king cobra, a Naga king. I don't know if you know, but king cobras can be 25, 30 feet long. Big, big snakes. Big, big snakes. And under the Muchalinda tree, this cobra lived there, that tree. The tree and the snake, they go together. They're archetypal. They go together in such a mythic way that it's dangerous. But when you're in fairy tale transcendental consciousness, the danger transmutes and becomes a blessing. So when he was sitting under the Muchalinda tree, the Naga king came out and wrapped himself 7 times around the Buddha's body and then rested his hooded head over his head. Now, if you saw this kind of image, you would think the guy is completely done for. The great Mexican muralist artist Siqueiros has an image of that where before some kind of vicious priest, this poor peasant is wrapped with this serpent all these times and completely, done for. But the Buddha was in a transmuted, inside-out situation where the peril became a blessing. Because the Naga king, the king cobra, had sensed that there was this tremendous lightning and thunderstorm. And in order to protect the Buddha, the enlightened one, he wrapped himself around the body to keep him safe and put his hooded head over to keep the rain and lightning off him. Because the Naga king in Asia, the wisdom saying is that no one knows more about a place than the snakes who live there. It's an old wisdom saying in Asia. The snakes know the underground as well as the above ground. They know more about a place than anyone. And the Naga king kept one tail in the ground, so if lightning would hit him, it would just shoot itself into the ground. So the 7 coils of the Naga king are under the Muchalinda tree. And then when the storm was over, when the 7 days were over, the 7 coils unraveled again. Just like the pratita samutpaya were coils of ignorance and its ramifications, which then undid themselves under the Bodhi tree. The whole mythic peril of the serpent in the tree undid itself at the Muchalinda tree. So he was not only freed there, he was freed here. Why is it paired? It's paired because the archetypal form of existence is through pairing. The frame of reference in wisdom traditions is not 4, but a pair of pairs. 2 twos. So the high Dharma way of writing it is not 4, but 2 squared. A pair paired. Or a double doubled. It's like looking at a stream. And you see the sky and the plants reflected in the stream. You can look over and you can see yourself in that setting. Well, there's a pair. And you can go into a very light samadhi, very delightful light samadhi, and it will also occur in that image. And something completely magical happens. It's like forest wisdom. In ancient times, most of these kinds of explorations took place in the forests, and only later did it take place in the mountains, in the Himalayas. But the early forms were always forest. The word for forest in Sanskrit, aranya, like we get Spanish for spiders, aranya. Aranyaka means forest gone. It means you're so at home that the forest has absorbed you and you belong there. So that, for instance, the largest Upanishad is called the Brihad Aranyaka, the great breath forest teaching. So the Buddha is there alone in the forest. He frees himself from dependent origination under the Bodhi tree, and he is freed. He has let go of the serpent in the tree under the Muchalinda tree, and it's that vertical pair. But the horizontal pair is also being let go in terms of other men, in terms of other beings. Under the Agapala Banyan tree, the one man, the sophisticated Brahmana, who comes to ask the specific identity of what is it that I am so that I can be what I am. And the Buddha says to him various things which end up saying that one could justly call himself a Brahmana whose behavior is uneven to nothing in the world. And the more you geometrize about that, the more you see what an incredible, smooth teacher the Buddha was. Silk. One rustle and one rustle only. You are what you are when what you do is uneven to nothing in the world. That's hell of a challenge. That's under the Agapala Banyan tree. Under the Rajayatana tree, the two who came were merchants. Two merchants, Tapusa and Balika. Two merchants came traveling on the road from Ukala to that place. Ukala is down in Orissa, in the southern part of East India. And they're traveling north, and they're coming through Bihar, and come upon this glow, this individual under this tree, just really glowing. Glowing in that sense that when you are in nature like that and you come upon a jewel, it stands out in the most incredible way. Or it's like in a night garden where one sees a single glowworm. And it's like an iridescent beacon. Even though it's tiny, it's the most dominating thing that there is. So a transcendent spirit in a forest is the number one center of attention. So they see him. And they, being good businessmen, want a little luck. Tell us something so that we can do better in our business, and we're ready to really pay attention. They wanted to show their reverence, so they shared their food. World round, that's the very first item. Share your food. If you eat food together, it's the beginning. And the merchants, Tapusa and Balika, took rice cakes and lumps of honey and went to the place where the Blessed One was, and having approached him and respectfully saluted the Blessed One, how would you salute? You don't say, "Hello, Enlightened One." You come up and you physiologically go, keeping your right side to him, go around. If you keep your right side and you go around, it means that you're in a clockwise fashion. It means that you're recognizing that you're in the natural cycle and that they are in the differential cycle. You're in the natural integration, and you respect them because they can go the other way. So standing near him, the merchants Tapusa and Balika addressed the Blessed One. This is in what's called the Vinaya texts. 3 volumes of these Vinaya texts. They're the accounts of how the whole order of the monks got founded. And in fact, this is excerpted and put into a special sutra, the Sutra on the Foundation of the Buddhist Order. So this section of the Vinaya text is brought out and is made a sutra which has a very long, complicated name. It means the Sutra of the way in which the order of the monks was founded. But notice here that in the square of attention of those 4 trees, there are no monks. The people who come to him are not Buddhists at all. There's a Brahmana, and there are 2 businessmen. So that the initial frame of reference of communicating enlightenment is before the monks are brought into the picture. It's very significant. Later, centuries and millennia conveniently forget that fact. And Buddhism becomes a monastic religion, full of people who are venerating sites where parts of the bones are. And in actuality, it's completely irrelevant. It has nothing whatsoever to do with it. I wish I could get an expression on my face like Jack Lemmon in his heyday. It's just, it has nothing whatsoever. It's totally useless. And to think that because you have a nice robe draped exactly right, that you're somehow part of the corporation is complete delusion. I was at a gathering, I think I might have told this one time, of the Venerable Walpole Raula was coming from Oxford University, the greatest learned Buddhist monk from Sri Lanka. He was visiting Los Angeles a number of years ago, about 20 years ago. And in this crowded room, there were monks of every color of robe, the Korean grays, the Zen black, the Tibetan reds, the saffron from the Theravadas, the yellow from Bangkok. It was an amazing array. And I was the only person in the room who didn't have a robe. I had to stand in the back, not in any hierarchy or any pecking order. And I was waiting, just there. And in comes this guy that for all the world, when he came in, he smiled. He looked exactly like Barry Fitzgerald in The Quiet Man. And the very first thing he said, can you believe it? He said, in the West, the Buddha has no robes. So I leaned against the door jamb. I thought, well, this might be interesting. And yet what was interesting is that all the rows of the monks of various colors of robes didn't hear it at all. They were all nicely arranging their robes to be there importantly, and that's why there are no robed people here today. Though the teaching is as pure as you can get it. When the Buddha went through the Bodhi tree, Muchalinda tree, vertical, he also went through the horizontal that went from the Agapala banyan tree to the Rajayatana tree. And when he said to the Brahmana under the banyan tree that you are who you are when your behavior is uneven to nothing in the world, that was evenly distributed to the 2 businessmen who, when they offered him food, was the first time that he realized the true conundrum that he was in. Because when they offered him the food, the Blessed One thought, he referred to himself as a Tathagata. Tathata means stuff. It means suchness. It means existence. Tathata is the inside-outness of shunyata. So Tathagata, gata means gone. the great Heart Sutra chant that is an amulet against all perilous evil. Gate, gate, paragati, parasam gati, bodhisvaha. In that gata, when it applies to one's tathata, one's suchness, tathagata means that one's suchness is gone. The mathematical orders hold in reality, but there's no content whatsoever. It's empty. It's a set that has no members, and therefore it differentiates equally with any integral application into infinity. In short form, it means that 0 and infinity are interchangeable in any logical sequence, which they indeed are. So the Blessed One thought the Tathagatas do not accept food with their hands. He's sitting there. They're offering him rice and honey. He's realizing a Tathagata doesn't accept food with their hands. Now with what shall I accept the rice cakes and lumps of honey? Then the 4 Maharaga gods, the 4 serpent higher archetypal images, understanding by the power of their minds the reflection which had risen in the mind of the Blessed One, offered to the Blessed One from the 4 quarters of the horizon 4 bowls made of stone, saying, May, O Lord, the Blessed One, accept herewith the rice cakes and the lumps of honey. The Blessed One accepted those new stone bowls, and therein he received the rice cakes and lumps of honey, and then he ate. Now, this is completely transcendental, differential, high dharma magic. It has nothing to do with mythology, has nothing to do with the mind, has nothing to do with legerdemain. There's no ritual involved whatsoever. It's that from 4 different perspectives, a stone bowl comes together, and the coming together has a single focus, and that single focus, which in enlightened integral patterning was a center of 0, turned inside out, it's the only place where anything could register. And so those 4 bowls, which are differential visionary bowls, actually become a bowl at only one locus in the entirety of reality, in that bodhicitta, that thought of enlightenment, that reality which was there. And so the Buddha had the bowl. It occurred right there. And so its occurrence was so profound that the bowl becomes a symbol. Like the Bodhi tree is a symbol in an amulet form of the Buddha's enlightenment, the bowl is a symbol in a talismanic form that he's able to go out into the world and teach. One's bowl, incidentally, usually was of such a size that whatever size your hands were, the 2 hands cupped together like this would be the size of your bowl. So it means that you didn't go out with one hand in your pocket with the bowl, or you didn't go out cavalierly. You went out focused that this bowl now is the only point that's real in the entire cosmos in which you occur. And therefore, whatever is put in the bowl is real. And eating that gives you a resonance of reality as long as that food lasts. And you are able then to function, to speak, to walk, to talk. And so the bowl becomes the fount, the sacred fount, out of which you are, can I use this kind of Christian language? You are baptized each meal in order to exist for one more day. And as long as you keep that in alignment, you continue to do that. When you come to a non-taking of food, that breaks it. That cuts it. That severs existence. And so the parinirvana of the Buddha is not to take food today. And that was it. So that there is a direct kind of a relationality between the bowl and the robe. To make that reversal and that confusion, to think that the robe guarantees your holiness, is like a costume, fictive, epic. That's bad script. That's poorly produced. That's overacted. That's a junk director. And yet it plays over and over and over again. It's the bowl that guarantees the continuity. And incidentally, the old tradition was that whatever is put in your bowl is what you eat. Whatever it is. To think that you could alter your diet by eating some kind of refined, vegetables, and therefore be purer, has nothing whatsoever to do with enlightenment. In fact, the apocryphal story is told of the leprous woman who puts this fruit into the Buddha's bowl and part of her finger falls off into the bowl. And it was part of the food of the day. It's that kind of apocryphal story to get it across loud and dirty that the content in a differential, transformed universe, that the content is not the determining factor. Because you're no longer dealing with just space, or even with time-space, but you're dealing with conscious time-space, which is at least a 5-dimensional continuum. And if you add the 4th dimension of time to space, space curves. And if you add consciousness of 5th dimension, the curves become fractal curlicues. They become capable of an infinite differentiation that is without end, world without end. That's the ancient way to say it. God be praised that He blesses this world without end. This kind of equality in Buddhism was accentuated not only by a bowl for food, but was accentuated by a bowl quality in language. And that's what the Dhammapada is. The Dhammapada is a selection of 423 different phrases, different sayings, different verses. Not only of the Buddha, many of the phrases occur outside of the Buddha's teachings. They come from classic Indian literature as well as from his sermons. So that the Dhammapada, the book, Dhamma is the southern Pali pronunciation of Dharma. A Dharma path, Dhammapada. The Dhammapada is a path which occurs only as you take it. There is no path. It's like in the, I guess the contemporary version of showing this is Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, where he has to cross over this chasm of openness and he steps out and there's an invisible support. And only to the extent that he walks on it is there a path. That's a Spielberg version of the ancient understanding that a Dharma path only occurs to the extent that you are taking it, and that it refines itself to the nuclear physics, the molecular details, the atomic structure, that only to the extent that you actually took this step did it actually happen. And that if you stop there, it's like not taking food for this day. That path is over. It no longer is there. So that a Dharma path only continues to exist as long as you continue to take it. And the fraction of a second that you hesitate and you don't take it, that path is gone. You have to find another path. That there are infinite other paths is a fractal guarantee of conscious time-space. But the peculiarity is that if you keep starting and stopping, you very quickly exhaust the more obvious paths that there are. You make it much more difficult for yourself to find what is a viable path. So one gets into this kind of diminishing returns of starting and stopping spiritual processes. As long as you continue, the process continues and registers in time-space. But to the extent you keep interrupting it, then it doesn't happen, and that whole avenue never again will ever happen. Well, you can see that in an ignorant time like ours, people have starts and stops all the time. How many spiritual paths have you started and not continued through in the last year, 10 years, 40 years? It builds up so that it's not like there's a gunk there, it's that there's no traction there in any obvious way. And of course, the body, sensing this, the body's very honest, it becomes disenchanted. It says, oh, this can't work. For the Buddha, those two merchants that came, Balika and Tapusa, when they came, this acceptance of food made a circumstance whereas the Buddha realized that he could teach. Just as he accepted the food and just ate, he could just do it. As long as he continued to do it without end, with continuity, it would continue. And so he came upon high Dharma trait. High Dharma trait is that someone who is doing a spiritual action continues with continuity, with evenness. You don't see them starting and stopping at all. They're always in this way, whatever way it is that they are. So that continuity, that Frank Lloyd Wright called such a form, he called it streamlined. And in fact, it's very similar to what the early Buddhists called it. They called it sotapanna in Pali. It means stream winner. Someone has won through to the stream, where one is able to live in nature, though one is in a transcendental capacity. That consciousness now infuses space-time such that there is a conscious space-time and one is able to continue to navigate and do, only as long as you continue an unbroken continuity in this way. And so the Buddha found that by starting to teach these two businessmen, if he just continued in that way, he could teach. And that's when he consulted his yogic powers of focusing in terms of time, space. If you are an author of a conscious time, space cosmos, you can certainly locate any time, space within it quite accurately, quite easily, no matter how far-flung it is. And he thought of teaching his old teacher, who was extremely bright, and he thought, as soon as I mention just one or two things, he will get it. And then he realized that he had died a few days before, 7 days before. And he thought of another super yogi who was just very dedicated that, oh yes, he'll get it also, maybe in a few minutes. And he realized he had died just that morning. So then he thought, well, the last 5 monks that I had been with when I was still trying to, force my body and force my mind to behave, to become enlightened, the result of that was that he just simply fainted. He fell into the dust. That mortification of the body and disciplining of the mind to that extent are negatives. They don't work. They short out what is a continuity. So he thought of those 5 monks. So he thought, I will go and I will talk to those 5 monks. The Dhammapada is from several centuries later of trying to understand how would you begin someone's learning, someone's teaching themselves something which is impossible to begin. And so the Dhammapada is an offering to you of a language that allows you to begin even though there's no beginning. And so it functions in that way, that as long as you would take a Dhammapada and read in it without end, to that extent, it would be a path for you. And that the Dhammapada is a part then of all of the recollected teachings, the sermons of the Buddha, that all of that also would be a part of that path. And though the Dhammapada is like very small path, say like stones set into a meadow in the midst of a mountain landscape, when you add all of the thousands of Buddhist remembered lectures and sermons together with that, the Dhammapada, though it begins with just stones set in wild grass, becomes a very large throughway. And that as long as you do this, almost any teaching that is resonant with the Buddha's teaching will add to this, so that eventually one has not only a super highway through a wilderness, but it's to the extent that the wilderness transforms itself into a park. That the way is so broad that the very landscape itself becomes a park rather than a wilderness. And that the extent of this park is not just this mountain range or just this continent on some planet, but extends to every aspect of the known universe. The entire universe becomes a park of your enlightenment. So that's the kind of quality that's there. And if we had time, we would go into the Dhammapada, but we need to close off for today. And we'll come back next week, not to the Dhammapada, but to science, to the wonderful mystery of a man like Richard Feynman and a woman like Mary Leakey. Mary Leakey with her cigars and Dalmatians, and Richard Feynman, who was a smart-ass genius, who was taken out of the precocious mathematical geniusness of his New York upbringing, New York City, but he happened to be chosen for one of the most peculiar events in world history. He was chosen by Oppenheimer to be one of the mathematicians at Los Alamos when they made the first atomic bomb. Feynman was the youngest, brattiest person there, and it completely got to him that something peculiar has happened. And though he kept his brattiness, he never forgot that he was a part of that little cluster of men and women who had monastically found a way to transform atomic energy, to turn atoms inside out. And it became this most peculiar of all things. He became a Pasadena madman who was also a universal genius, almost on scale like a Buddha. And we'll talk about him next week.